It's 1992 and Yugoslavia is collapsing. While the world watches the Soviet Union fall apart, another communist federation is dying down here in the Balkans. Three ethnic groups in Bosnia are about to fight the deadliest European war in 50 years, killing over 100,000 people and displacing more than 2 million. Current 2025 analysis shows us exactly why this conflict was inevitable and how it permanently changed the demographics of an entire region. The latest data reveals striking transformations that prove the war's lasting impact. Sarajevo's population shifted from 49% Bosniak before the war to over 80% today. These numbers tell the story of a conflict that wasn't random violence, but systematic demographic engineering that reshaped the Balkans forever. The powder keg that was always going to explode. To understand how this happened, we need to examine the demographic puzzle that was Bosnia in 1992. The 1991 census showed 43.7% of the population were Bosniaks, 31.4% were Serbs, and 17.3% were Croats. But these numbers hide the real story. Unlike other Yugoslav republics where ethnic groups lived in separate regions, Bosnia's three communities were mixed together in a complex pattern across the country. Sarajevo had roughly equal numbers of all three groups living on the same streets. This ethnic mixing had been Yugoslavia's strength, but it was about to become its fatal weakness. The collapse of communism in 1991 removed the one ideology that held these groups together for 5 decades. Communist Yugoslavia had actively promoted a unified Yugoslav identity that transcended ethnic lines. Mixed marriages were common, reaching over 25% of all marriages by 1991. Cities like Sarajevo prided themselves on being cosmopolitan and multicultural. But when the communist system fell apart, there was nothing to replace it except competing nationalisms. Each ethnic group began to see the others not as fellow citizens, but as potential threats to their survival in a post-communist world. The geographic distribution of these ethnic groups created a military nightmare. Serbs formed clear majorities in eastern Bosnia along the Drina River and in much of northern Bosnia. But they also lived in significant numbers throughout central Bosnia and even in Sarajevo itself. Croats dominated western Herzegovina, but had substantial populations in central Bosnia and along the Sava River. Bosniaks were concentrated in central Bosnia and the larger cities, but lived everywhere across the country. This meant that no matter how you drew the borders of a new Bosnian state, large numbers of each ethnic group would end up as minorities in territories controlled by others. Economic collapse made these demographic tensions explosive. Yugoslavia's economy had been failing since the 1980s, with inflation reaching 2,500% by 1991. In Bosnia, unemployment hit 25% by early 1992. When communist job security disappeared, people competed for shrinking resources along ethnic lines. Serbs controlled most of the heavy industry and had dominated the military officer corps. Croats had strong business networks and connections to Croatia's growing economy. Bosniaks feared they would be economically marginalized in any new political arrangement. As resources became scarce, economic competition turned into ethnic competition. The question of who would control an independent Bosnia became the central issue driving the conflict. Bosniaks, as the largest group, expected to dominate any democratic government. But Serbs and Croats had watched what happened in Croatia, where Serb minorities faced discrimination after Croatian independence. They weren't willing to become minorities in a Bosniak-dominated state. The problem was that Bosnia's ethnic geography made partition almost impossible. Unlike other Yugoslav republics where ethnic groups could be separated relatively cleanly, Bosnia's mixed population meant that any division would leave large ethnic minorities stranded in hostile territory. Nationalism filled the ideological vacuum left by communism's collapse. Bosniak politicians began emphasizing their Muslim identity and connections to the broader Islamic world. Serbian politicians talked about protecting Serbs from Islamic fundamentalism and creating links with Serbia proper. Croatian politicians spoke of ancient Croatian lands and the need to protect Croatian culture. These nationalist narratives replaced the shared Yugoslav identity that had kept peace for decades. Each group began to see the others not as neighbors, but as historical enemies who could never be trusted. The demographic patterns from 1992 predicted exactly where the worst violence would occur. The 1991 census data shows that the most brutal fighting happened in areas where ethnic groups were most mixed. Prijedor, which was 44% Serb, 44% Bosniak, and 6% Croat, became the site of massive ethnic cleansing. Mostar, split between Bosniaks and Croats, saw some of the war's fiercest urban combat. The Drina River Valley, where Serb and Bosniak villages alternated for miles, experienced systematic massacres. Meanwhile, areas with clear ethnic majorities like Serb-dominated Banja Luka or Croat-controlled Western Herzegovina saw less violence, even though ethnic cleansing still occurred. These mixed areas became flashpoints because they represented the greatest threat to nationalist dreams of ethnic purity. A Serb village surrounded by Bosniak territory couldn't be easily incorporated into a greater Serbia. A Bosniak enclave in Serb-controlled territory undermined claims that the area was historically Serbian. The solution, from a nationalist perspective, was to eliminate these mixed areas through forced displacement or worse. The demographic map of Bosnia in 1992 was essentially a target list for ethnic cleansing. Current 2025 demographic data reveals just how successful this ethnic separation became. Sarajevo, once 49% Bosniak, 30% Serb, and 7% Croat, is now over 80% Bosniak. Banja Luka, which was 55% Serb, 15% Bosniak, and 15% Croat in 1991, is now 95% Serb. The Croat majority areas of Herzegovina have become even more ethnically homogeneous. The demographic mixing that characterized pre-war Bosnia has been almost completely eliminated. What took centuries to create was destroyed in just 3 years of war. The war wasn't random violence driven by ancient hatreds. It was a systematic campaign to resolve Bosnia's demographic puzzle through force. The 1992 census data shows exactly where ethnic groups live together, and the 2025 data shows how successfully they were separated. Every massacre, every destroyed village, every forced deportation followed the logic of creating ethnically pure territories. The demographic fault lines visible in 1992 became the battle lines of 1992 to 1995, and today they form the invisible borders of a country that remains divided 30 years after the war ended. But before the shooting started, there was one last attempt at a political solution. The international community demanded that Bosnia prove it wanted independence through a democratic vote, the independence vote that sealed Bosnia's fate. On March 1, 1992, Bosnia announced the results of its independence referendum. 99% of voters said yes to independence from Yugoslavia. This number sounds like the kind of overwhelming mandate that creates stable new nations. But these results were about to tear Bosnia apart instead of uniting it. The 99% yes vote wasn't a sign of consensus. It was proof that an entire ethnic group had given up on participating in Bosnia's future. The referendum took place over 2 days, February 29th and March 1st, 1992. European community leaders had told Bosnia it needed to hold this vote before they would recognize its independence. Croatia and Slovenia had already been recognized in December 1991, and Bosnia wanted the same international legitimacy. The Bosnian government, led by President Alija Izetbegović, saw the referendum as their path to joining the community of independent European nations. They expected strong support from Bosniaks and Croats who wanted to escape Serbian domination of Yugoslavia. But the electoral data tells a different story than the headline numbers suggest. The 63% turnout rate was actually quite low for such a crucial decision about the country's future. More importantly, the turnout varied dramatically by municipality, revealing the ethnic divisions that would soon explode into war. In Sarajevo, turnout reached 85% as urban Bosniaks and Croats enthusiastically supported independence. But in Pale, the mountain town that would become the Serb capital, barely 8% of eligible voters showed up. This stark contrast between 85% and 8% turnout in neighboring areas showed that Bosnia's ethnic groups were making fundamentally different choices about their future. The vote reflected Bosniak Croat support while Serbs refused to participate. Municipalities with Bosniak majorities consistently showed turnout rates above 70%. Areas with significant Croat populations also participated heavily, with turnout often exceeding 65%. But in municipalities where Serbs formed majorities, participation collapsed. The pattern was so consistent that you could predict a municipality's ethnic composition just by looking at how many people voted. The boycott wasn't accidental or spontaneous. Bosnian Serb leaders had organized a systematic campaign to reject the referendum's legitimacy. They argued that no ethnic group should be forced to leave Yugoslavia without its consent. Radovan Karadžić, leader of the Bosnian Serb Democratic Party, told his supporters that participating in the vote would legitimize Bosniak domination. Serbian Orthodox priests urged their congregations to stay home. Serb-controlled media portrayed the referendum as a trap designed to make Serbs minorities in their own ancestral lands. The geographic distribution of voting and non-voting areas created a preview of the coming war. The municipalities that boycotted the referendum formed a horseshoe shape around Sarajevo, stretching from the Croatian border in the west, through northern Bosnia, and down to the Serbian border in the east. This pattern wasn't random. It reflected the areas where Serbs felt they had the demographic strength to create their own state. The referendum results essentially drew the battle lines that would define the next 3 years of fighting. International recognition of the referendum results gave the Bosnian government the legal foundation it needed to declare independence. The European community and the United States accepted the 99% yes vote as proof that Bosnians wanted to leave Yugoslavia. They ignored the low turnout and the obvious ethnic boycott. This international backing meant that when Bosnia declared independence on March 3, 1992, it immediately gained diplomatic recognition from major world powers. The Bosnian government now had international law on its side. But recognition also created a crisis of legitimacy for Bosnia's Serb population. From their perspective, they had been forced into an independent Bosnia without their consent. The referendum had asked whether Bosnia should be independent, but it hadn't asked whether Serbs wanted to be part of that independent state. They saw the international recognition as proof that the world was conspiring to trap them in a Muslim-dominated country. This sense of betrayal would fuel Serb nationalism throughout the coming war. The immediate Serb response was to declare their own referendum. On March 9 and 10, 1992, Bosnian Serbs held their own vote on whether to remain part of Yugoslavia. This referendum was held only in Serb-majority areas and achieved 96% support for staying with Yugoslavia. The turnout was much higher than the original referendum, reaching 85% in most Serb municipalities. But the international community refused to recognize these results, dismissing them as an illegal attempt to partition Bosnia. The competing referendum results created two incompatible visions of Bosnia's future. The March 1 vote showed that Bosniaks and Croats wanted independence and expected to control the new state. The March 9 vote proved that Serbs rejected independence and wanted to remain part of Yugoslavia. There was no middle ground between these positions. The referendum had forced each ethnic group to choose sides, and they had chosen different sides. The correlation between voting patterns and later ethnic cleansing zones was almost perfect. The municipalities that boycotted the independence referendum became the core territories of Republika Srpska, the Serb entity declared in April 1992. Areas like Prijedor, Bijeljina, and Zvornik, which had minimal participation in the March 1 vote, became sites of the most systematic ethnic cleansing. The Serb forces that took control of these areas justified their actions by pointing to the referendum boycott as proof that local Serbs had never consented to Bosnian independence. The 2025 population data reveals how successfully these referendum divisions were transformed into permanent demographic separation. Municipalities that boycotted the independence vote are now almost entirely Serb. The areas that voted for independence remain under Bosniak or Croat control, but they too have become ethnically homogeneous through displacement of minority populations. Today's demographic data shows that the referendum didn't create a unified Bosnia. Instead, it created a roadmap for partition that took 3 years of war to complete. The 99% yes vote that seemed to show overwhelming support for independence actually revealed that Bosnia's ethnic groups could no longer live together in the same state. The areas that voted yes remained with Bosnia, while the areas that boycotted the vote became Republika Srpska. The referendum had asked one question about independence, but had answered a different question about whether multi-ethnic Bosnia could survive. The Bosnian Serb Declaration of Independence wasn't a spontaneous reaction to the referendum results. It was part of a larger strategy that had been years in the making, orchestrated by a leader whose vision extended far beyond Bosnia's borders. Milosevic's master plan for Greater Serbia. Slobodan Milosevic had spent years preparing for this moment. As president of Serbia, he wasn't just supporting ethnic Serbs in Bosnia. He was executing a carefully planned strategy to create a Greater Serbia that would unite all Serbian lands under Belgrade's control. The recognition of Republika Srpska wasn't spontaneous solidarity with fellow Serbs. It was the opening move in a campaign to redraw Yugoslavia's borders through systematic demographic engineering. Milosevic had risen to power by becoming head of the Serbian Communist Party in 1987 on a platform of Serbian nationalism that replaced the communist ideology holding Yugoslavia together. He understood that Serbia's demographic strength lay not just within its own borders, but in the Serbian populations scattered across other Yugoslav republics. In Bosnia, 1.3 million Serbs lived in areas that could potentially be connected to Serbia proper. In Croatia, another 600,000 Serbs occupied territories along the border with Bosnia. Milosevic saw these populations as the foundation for a greater Serbian state that would control much of the former Yugoslavia's territory. The strategy required transforming scattered Serbian communities into contiguous territory under Serbian control. This meant eliminating the mixed populations that had characterized Yugoslavia for decades. In Bosnia, Serbs formed clear majorities in about 60% of the territory, but this land was interrupted by Bosniak and Croat enclaves that prevented easy connection to Serbia. Milosevic's plan required clearing these non-Serbian populations to create unbroken Serbian territory stretching from Belgrade to the Adriatic Sea. The Yugoslav People's Army became Milosevic's primary tool for implementing this vision. By 1991, Serbian officers controlled 70% of the JNA's command structure, even though Serbs made up only 36% of Yugoslavia's population. When Slovenia and Croatia declared independence, Milosevic had already begun withdrawing JNA units from those republics and repositioning them in Bosnia. These weren't random troop movements. They were deliberate preparations for the partition of Bosnia along ethnic lines. Throughout 1991, the JNA systematically distributed weapons to Serbian civilian populations in Bosnia, creating a network of armed militias that could quickly take control of Serbian-majority areas. The coordination between Belgrade and Bosnian Serb forces was extensive and systematic. When Radovan Karadžić declared Republika Srpska in April 1992, he wasn't acting independently. Serbian military advisors had been working with Bosnian Serb leaders for months to prepare for this moment. Milosevic's January 1991 speech had explicitly called for the creation of Greater Serbia, and the March Directive 7 orders provided the operational framework for achieving this goal. By the time war began, Bosnian Serb forces had inherited most of the JNA's heavy weapons and equipment stationed in Bosnia. On April 7, 1992, Milosevic formally recognized Republika Srpska, providing the international legitimacy that Bosnian Serb forces needed to begin their campaign. Milosevic's territorial ambitions required connecting three separate Serbian regions into a single state. The first region was eastern Bosnia along the Drina River, which bordered Serbia directly and had clear Serbian majorities. The second was northern Bosnia, which controlled the approaches to Belgrade and had significant Serbian populations. The third was western Bosnia and parts of Croatia, which would give Greater Serbia access to the sea. Connecting these regions required eliminating the Bosniak and Croat populations that lived between them. The demographic engineering began immediately after the war started. Serbian forces didn't just occupy territory, they systematically expelled non-Serbian populations to create ethnically pure zones. In Bijeljina, one of the first towns to fall under Serbian control, the pre-war population was 59% Bosniak and 31% Serb. Within weeks of the takeover, virtually all Bosniaks had been killed or expelled. This pattern was repeated across dozens of municipalities as Serbian forces implemented what they called ethnic cleansing to create the demographic conditions for Greater Serbia. Milosevic's media apparatus prepared Serbian public opinion for this campaign by portraying it as defensive action. Serbian television showed footage of alleged atrocities against Serbs in other republics, often using fake or staged images to inflame nationalist sentiment. The message was consistent. Serbs were under attack everywhere in Yugoslavia and needed to unite to defend themselves. This propaganda campaign made ordinary Serbs see the war in Bosnia not as aggression, but as necessary self-defense against Islamic fundamentalism and Croatian fascism. Financial support from Belgrade sustained the Bosnian Serb war effort throughout the conflict. The Serbian government provided salaries for Bosnian Serb military officers, funding for weapons purchases, and subsidies for fuel and food. This economic support was crucial because Republika Srpska had no functioning economy of its own. The territory it controlled was primarily agricultural, with most of Bosnia's industrial capacity remaining in government-controlled areas. Without Belgrade's backing, the Bosnian Serb military would have collapsed within months. The coordination extended to the highest levels of both governments. Milosevic met regularly with Radovan Karadžić and General Ratko Mladić, the commander of Bosnian Serb forces. These meetings weren't just diplomatic consultations, they were operational planning sessions where military strategy was coordinated between Serbia and Republika Srpska. Intelligence sharing was extensive, with Serbian security services providing information about Bosnian government forces and international diplomatic positions. The legal framework for this strategy was established through the constitutional structures of both Serbia and Republika Srpska. The Serbian constitution was amended to allow for the eventual incorporation of Serbian territories from other republics. Republika Srpska's constitution explicitly stated that it was part of the Serbian nation and could join Serbia at any time. These legal preparations showed that the war wasn't about creating an independent Bosnian Serb state. It was about creating Serbian territory that would eventually be absorbed into Greater Serbia. By 1995, much of Milosevic's territorial vision had been achieved. Serbian forces controlled about 70% of Bosnia's territory, and most of this land had been ethnically cleansed of non-Serbian populations. The demographic map of Bosnia had been fundamentally altered to create the contiguous Serbian territory that Greater Serbia required. But the most visible symbol of this campaign would unfold in Bosnia's capital, where the world would witness the systematic destruction of everything that multicultural Yugoslavia had represented. The siege that shocked the world. Sarajevo became the focal point of this campaign. In April 1992, it was Yugoslavia's most multicultural city. The 1991 census showed that 49.2% of the population were Bosniaks, 29.8% were Serbs, and 6.6% were Croats. But these numbers don't capture what made Sarajevo unique. Unlike other Yugoslav cities where ethnic groups lived in separate neighborhoods, Sarajevo's communities were completely mixed. Serbian families lived next door to Bosniak families who lived across the street from Croatian families. The city's schools were integrated, with children from all three groups attending classes together. Mixed marriages were common, reaching 25% of all unions in the city. Sarajevo hosted the 1984 Winter Olympics, and the world had seen it as a symbol of multicultural harmony. People identified as Sarajevans first, then as Yugoslavs, with ethnic identity often coming third. This mixing made Sarajevo the perfect target for Serbian nationalist strategy. A multicultural Sarajevo contradicted everything Milosevic's Greater Serbia project represented. If Serbs, Bosniaks, and Croats could live together peacefully in Bosnia's capital, it undermined the argument that ethnic separation was necessary for peace. The city had to be transformed from a symbol of multiculturalism into proof that ethnic coexistence was impossible. The siege wasn't designed to capture Sarajevo militarily. It was designed to destroy the idea of Sarajevo as a multicultural city forever. Serbian forces positioned themselves in the hills surrounding Sarajevo with mathematical precision. They occupied strategic hilltop positions in Grbavica and Srebrenica that gave them complete visibility over the city center. Heavy artillery was placed in Lukavica, Pale, and Ilidza, creating a ring of firepower around the valley where Sarajevo sits. The positioning wasn't random. Serbian military planners had studied the city's geography for months and identified exactly where to place weapons for maximum psychological impact. They could hit any target in the city within minutes, but more importantly, they could make every resident feel constantly watched and threatened. The systematic targeting of civilian areas began immediately and followed a deliberate pattern. Markets were hit during busy morning hours when families were shopping for food. Schools were targeted during class time when children were most vulnerable. The Markale market was shelled on February 5, 1994, killing 68 people and wounding 144. The same market was hit again on August 28, 1995, killing 43 more people. Hospitals treating wounded civilians became targets themselves.